The message reached Earth on a cold morning in December. Admiral Sarah stood in the command center of the United Earth Defense Force when the transmission came through. Her face turned pale as she watched the footage. 17 human colonies across 3 star systems had been reduced to burning rubble in less than 48 hours. The Dominion had struck without warning, without mercy, and without any attempt at communication. The images showed cities burning, children running through streets filled with smoke, families trying to escape in transport ships that were shot down before they could leave the atmosphere. They had not come to conquer, they had come to exterminate. Over 300 million human beings died in those 48 hours. The youngest colony, New Eden, had been home to a population of mostly young families who had left Earth seeking a better life among the stars. None of them survived. Admiral played the final transmission from governor of the 22B colony. His voice was calm, even as explosions could be heard in the background. He spoke directly to Earth, to anyone who would listen. He said that they had given no reason for their attack. They had simply appeared in orbit and begun their bombardment. His last words before the transmission cut off were simple. He asked Earth to remember them and to make sure this never happened to anyone else. For 3 days, Earth was silent. The entire planet seemed to hold its breath. People gathered in streets, in churches, in homes. They watched the footage over and over again. They saw their sons and daughters, their brothers and sisters, their friends and neighbors turned to ash by an alien empire they had never even met. And then, on the 4th day, something changed in humanity. The United Earth Council met in an emergency session that lasted for 16 hours. Representatives from every nation on Earth spoke. Some called for peace negotiations. Others demanded immediate retaliation. But one voice rose above the rest. It belonged to Director James of the Earth Strategic Command. He did not speak of revenge or hatred. He spoke of survival. He reminded the Council that if they could destroy 17 colonies without warning, they could do the same to Earth. He said that humanity faced a choice. They could wait for the enemy to come to them, or they could take the fight to the enemy and make sure they never threatened another human life again. The vote was unanimous. Earth would go to war. In the months that followed, humanity underwent a transformation that no one had thought possible. Factories that had been producing consumer goods were converted to weapons manufacturing. Scientists who had been working on commercial projects were reassigned to military research. Every shipyard on Earth and in the asteroid belt began producing warships at a pace that would have seemed insane just 1 year earlier. But the true surprise came from the people themselves. Recruitment centers were overwhelmed with volunteers. Young men and women from every country on Earth lined up to join the newly formed Earth Expeditionary Force. They were not motivated by glory or adventure. They were motivated by something far more powerful. They had seen what happened to their fellow humans, and they refused to let it happen again. The Dominion controlled a vast territory spanning over 200 star systems. Their empire had existed for over 10,000 years. They had conquered and absorbed dozens of alien civilizations during that time. They viewed humans as nothing more than a minor nuisance, a primitive species that had barely begun to explore beyond their own solar system. When they destroyed the human colonies, they expected Earth to cower in fear. They expected humanity to beg for mercy or perhaps try to negotiate some kind of peace treaty. They did not expect what actually happened. 18 months after the attack on the colonies, the first Earth fleet entered space. It consisted of 200 warships, each one carrying weapons that they had never seen before. Human scientists had been working in secret, developing technologies that they had originally intended for peaceful purposes. Now those technologies had been turned into instruments of war. Plasma cannons that could cut through shields like paper. Quantum torpedoes that could appear inside enemy ships without warning. Electronic warfare systems that could take over computer networks and turn their own defenses against them. The border fleet was destroyed in less than 3 hours. The human fleet did not stop to celebrate. They pushed deeper into enemy territory, striking at military installations, supply depots, and communication centers. They did not attack civilian targets. Admiral had been very clear about that. She said that humanity would not become the monsters they were fighting. They would destroy the military capability, but they would not murder innocents. News of the human advance spread through the Dominion like wildfire. At first, the leadership refused to believe the reports. They insisted that it must be some kind of mistake. How could a species that had only achieved interstellar travel a century ago possibly pose a threat to an empire that had existed for 10,000 years? But as more and more reports came in, the truth became impossible to deny. The humans were not just fighting back. They were winning. The High Command assembled their largest fleet in 3,000 years. 5,000 warships gathered near the capital system, ready to crush the human invaders once and for all. They were confident in their victory. After all, they outnumbered the human fleet by more than 10 to 1. Their ships were larger, their weapons more powerful, their crews more experienced. There was no way the humans could possibly win. Admiral stood on the bridge of the flagship Earth's Vengeance as her fleet approached the Armada. She had only 400 ships under her command. Her officers looked nervous, and she did not blame them. The odds were not in their favor, but she had studied them carefully over the past 18 months. She had learned their tactics, their weaknesses, and their psychology, and she had a plan. The battle began with the fleet advancing in their traditional formation. It was the same formation they had used for thousands of years, the same formation that had brought them victory after victory against countless enemies. But the humans did not fight like the enemies they had faced before. Instead of meeting them head-on, the human fleet scattered into smaller groups. They used their superior speed and maneuverability to strike at the edges of the formation, drawing individual ships away from the main fleet and destroying them one by one. The commanders tried to adapt, but their rigid hierarchy worked against them. Every decision had to be approved by the High Command, and by the time orders were issued, the humans had already changed their tactics. The human captains, on the other hand, had been given the freedom to make their own decisions based on the situation in front of them. It was a fundamental difference in philosophy, and it proved to be decisive. The battle lasted for 3 days. When it was over, the fleet had been reduced to less than 500 ships. The humans had lost nearly half their fleet, but they had achieved something that no one had thought possible. They had defeated the largest military force in the known galaxy. Word of the defeat spread throughout the Dominion. For the first time in 10,000 years, the citizens of the Empire began to question their leaders. How could they have lost to a species they had dismissed as primitive? How could their mighty fleet have been destroyed by creatures they had tried to exterminate? The questions led to protests, and the protests led to unrest. The foundations of the Dominion began to crack. Admiral did not pause to rest. She knew that the war was far from over. She pushed her remaining ships deeper into territory, liberating the planets they had conquered, freeing the species they had enslaved. Everywhere she went, she found allies. Species that had been subjugated by them for centuries saw an opportunity for freedom and took it. They rose up against their oppressors, joining the human fleet in its advance toward the final battle took place above Prime, the ancient heart of the Dominion. They had gathered every ship they had left for one last desperate defense. It was not enough. The combined forces of humanity and their new allies overwhelmed the defenses in a matter of hours. Admiral transmitted a message to the leadership, offering them a choice. They could surrender unconditionally and face justice for their crimes, or they could continue to fight and face total annihilation. The Supreme Council debated for less than an hour before accepting the terms of surrender. 10,000 years of empire came to an end not with a grand final battle, but with a simple transmission acknowledging defeat. In the aftermath of the war, humanity found itself in a position it had never expected. They were now the dominant military power in this region of the galaxy. Other species looked to them for leadership and protection. The humans who had once been seen as primitives were now viewed as liberators and heroes. Admiral retired from military service 1 year after the war ended. She had seen enough destruction to last several lifetimes. She spent her remaining years helping to rebuild the civilizations that had been devastated by oppression. She never forgot the 300 million humans who had died in the initial attack. Their names were inscribed on a memorial that orbited Earth, a permanent reminder of the cost of the war and the reason it had been fought. Humanity learned something important from its conflict with the. They learned that they were capable of incredible things when they worked together. They learned that their diversity, their creativity, and their refusal to surrender were their greatest strengths. And they learned that the galaxy was a dangerous place, full of species that would not hesitate to destroy them if given the chance. But they also learned something else. They learned that they were not alone. The allies they had made during the war remained their friends in peace. Together, they formed a new alliance dedicated to protecting the weak and defending the innocent. It was called the Coalition of Free Worlds, and it became the foundation of a new era of peace and cooperation that would last for centuries. The Dominion had thought that destroying human colonies would break humanity. Instead, it had awakened something within them. It had reminded them of who they were and what they could become. The children of Earth had looked into the void and found that they were not afraid. They had faced an empire that had existed for 10,000 years and brought it to its knees. And in doing so, they had proven something that the galaxy would never forget. Humanity was not a species to be underestimated. They were not a species that would surrender. They were a species that would fight for their survival, for their freedom, and for each other. And anyone who threatened them would face the consequences. The stars now belonged to all who believed in freedom, and humanity would make sure it stayed that way.